What if today I sat at this table not to preach, but to question everything, alongside the man who declared the death of God?
I am Friedrich Nietzsche. Here, ideas collide without filters. Stay until the end, like, subscribe, and comment who should join this debate. Your morality, the one you proclaim as the path to salvation, strikes me as one of the most cunning and dangerous inversions that human weakness has ever invented. You call love what I suspect is disguised resentment. You name humility what reeks of concealed contempt for everything that rises, shines, and affirms its power. Isn't your compassion a subtle way of keeping the weak in their weakness, of preventing life from expressing itself in its necessary harshness? You canonize suffering, turn it into virtue, and thus manage to make the sufferer feel superior to the creator, to the risk-taker, to the one who affirms life without apologizing for existing. Your doctrine doesn't liberate, it consolidates resentment as a structure of valuation. Whoever cannot conquer declares their importance sacred. Whoever fears strength invents meekness as excellence. Could it be that your entire moral architecture protects precisely the diminished life against the ascending life?
You speak of weakness as if it were a permanent state, and you speak of strength as if whoever has it never loses it. But tell me, have you ever seen a powerful man fall sick? Have you seen him lose someone he loves, grow old, doubt himself in the middle of the night? The strength you describe doesn't exist outside of time. Every man who creates today will be laid low tomorrow. Everyone who ascends will find a limit. I don't call impotence sacred, I call it a lie to fantasize that someone can remain always ascending. Compassion doesn't consolidate weakness, it recognizes that the strong today will be vulnerable tomorrow, and that treating them as disposable today means building a world where no one will be safe when their turn comes to fall. Or do you believe your power will protect you forever from pain, from illness, from loss, from old age? You call resentment what is simply looking straight at what makes us all equal.
That equality you invoke is precisely the poison. I don't deny that everyone falls sick or dies, I deny that this justifies building a morality from sickness and death. You turn what is biological accident into axiological foundation. Yes, the strong fall sick, but does that mean we should value life from the sick person's perspective? You affirm that no one is safe when they fall, and therefore you propose a morality that secures everyone from below. But that is leveling toward the ground. Life is not measured by its lowest common denominator but by its peaks. Your compassion doesn't look straight at what makes us equal, it looks downward and from there founds value. The Creator accepts his finitude without thereby erecting finitude as criterion. He accepts the fall without declaring that the fall is the only horizon from which to judge. Isn't your strategy to convert the condition of the weakest into universal tribunal?
I don't convert sickness into foundation, I ask you what foundation resists when sickness arrives. Your Creator, what does he create when he can no longer create? Does he lose his value when he loses his power? If only whoever ascends has value, then you'll have value until you stop ascending, and after that you'll be waste. That's not affirming life, it's affirming one moment of life and despising all the others. I don't propose leveling toward the ground, I propose recognizing that the ground is where we all are when our forces fail, and that how we treat whoever is there reveals what kind of world we build. A man who today despises the weak because they are weak will tomorrow be despised when he himself falters. I'm not speaking from the tribunal of the weakest, I'm speaking from the only certainty you have, which is shared vulnerability. What will you do when you're the one who needs compassion and you discover that no one learned it?
You present a scenario where compassion functions as existential insurance. Be compassionate because someday you'll need others to be compassionate toward you. That's not love, it's prudence disguised as virtue. It's the merchant's morality, I give so that they'll give to me. But there's something more troubling in your argument. You reduce all valuation to the survival of the vulnerable self. As if the only thing that mattered were guaranteeing mutual assistance in the fall. But life is also creation, risk, affirmation beyond security. The one who creates accepts destroying himself in the process. The one who truly loves doesn't calculate reciprocity. The one who affirms doesn't ask for guarantees. Your morality of, we all fall, turns existence into a waiting room for the shared debacle. What if there were ways of inhabiting life that don't reduce to managing collective vulnerability?
I'm not proposing insurance, I'm describing reality. You can reject compassion, but you can't reject that you'll depend on others when your forces fail. You call prudence what is simply recognizing how the world works. You say the Creator accepts destroying himself, but who picks up his pieces when he's destroyed? Who feeds him if he falls sick in the middle of his work? Who cares for his children if he dies creating? I don't reduce life to managing vulnerability, I say that whoever ignores vulnerability builds castles on sand. The risk you celebrate depends on structures that don't risk. Someone cultivated the bread you eat while you create. Someone cared for your childhood while you were incapable of fending for yourself. You call it disguise to recognize that dependence, but without it your Creator would never have arrived at creating. Or did you grow up without anyone feeding you, teaching you, sustaining you in your childhood weakness?
You touch on a delicate point, I admit. Childhood dependence, the need for care, that's undeniable. But you confuse the description of a need with the prescription of a morality. Yes, I was cared for as a child. Yes, whoever creates depends on prior structures. But it doesn't follow from this that I should erect that dependence into supreme value. The child who was cared for can, upon growing, thank that care precisely by overcoming it, by affirming something beyond mere preservation. You turn biological necessity into eternal moral duty. You make mutual assistance the complete horizon of meaning. But there's something in the human being that isn't satisfied only with being sustained, it wants to create, overcome, go beyond security. Isn't it possible to honor the care received precisely by transcending it, instead of reproducing it as the only norm? Isn't there greatness beyond gratitude converted into system?
I don't convert care into the only norm, I ask what kind of transcendence despises the care that made it possible. You speak of overcoming, of going beyond, but everyone who goes beyond leaves behind those who cannot follow. The child grows and creates, granted, but what happens with the child who cannot grow because he was born sick? What happens with whoever cared for you and now ages without being able to create anything you'd consider valuable? Your transcendence works for whoever has the strength to transcend. For the others, it's only the reminder of their exclusion. I'm not speaking of reproducing care as a closed system, I'm speaking of the fact that if your greatness needs to despise whoever cares in order to shine, then your greatness depends on making invisible the conditions that sustain it. What's great about a creation that requires forgetting everyone who made it possible for you to create?
Again you slip in a dangerous equivalence. I'm not proposing to forget, I'm proposing not to reduce all value to the caregiver's logic. I recognize that I was sustained, but that recognition doesn't imply that my only way of honoring it is to perpetuate the same logic eternally. There are forms of gratitude that don't consist of imitation but of offering something different, something that transcends the mere reproduction of what was received. You put on stage the sick child, the unproductive elder, and you expect me to be paralyzed by guilt. But that strategy is revealing. You use the suffering of the vulnerable as an unanswerable argument. Any affirmation that goes beyond immediate care is automatically condemned as contempt for the weak. It's a very cunning way of closing off all space for valuation that doesn't submit to your tribunal of vulnerability. Isn't that the fundamental trick of your morality?
I'm not using suffering as an argument, I'm asking you if your system of values has a place for whoever suffers without you being able to extract from their suffering any creation, any lesson, any transcendence. I'm not seeking to paralyze you with guilt, I'm seeking for you to respond to a concrete situation. The sick child is there. The elder who no longer creates is there. You can call it a trick to mention them, but they are still there. I'm not asking you to perpetuate the logic of care eternally. I'm asking if in your world, where value lies in transcending and creating, there's any value for whoever can do neither of these things. I'm not building a tribunal, I'm describing real people. Your response so far has been to point out that I mentioned their existence as if it were a trap. But I haven't yet heard what place they have in your system. Do they have one, or simply don't they count?
You demand from me an administrative answer. What place do they have, as if my task were to design a social assistance program. But my question is another. Why should the value of a vision of life be measured by its capacity to include everyone? That premise is already Christian. You take for granted that a perspective is only legitimate if no one is left out. But life itself excludes. Life itself selects, discards, differentiates. The sick child you mention is a tragedy, I accept that. But from that tragedy I don't extract the conclusion that all valuation should be subordinated to avoiding tragedies. You turn the painful exception into universal rule. You build your entire morality from the point of maximum vulnerability and then declare immoral any perspective that doesn't do the same. Isn't that imposing your own criterion under the appearance of defending the defenseless?
I'm not demanding that you design social assistance, I'm demanding that you respond whether for you that child has any value or doesn't have it. You say that life excludes, selects, discards. Agreed. But you are not life, you're a man who chooses how to treat other men. You can observe that nature discards, but when you discard someone you're not being natural, you're making a decision. You say I turn the exception into rule, but that child is not an exception. Extreme vulnerability touches many, and moderate vulnerability touches us all at some point. I don't build morality from the maximum point of vulnerability, I build from the fact that we all pass through some degree of vulnerability and that how we're treated then defines the world we live in. You can say I defend the defenseless, but what do you defend when you defend exclusion?
I defend the possibility that there exist valuations not subordinated to the imperative of total inclusion. I defend that the meaning of life doesn't reduce to minimizing suffering. I defend that there are human experiences, creation, risk, tragic affirmation, that don't fit in your scheme of mutual care. I don't discard the sick child as you insinuate, I simply deny that his existence invalidates every perspective that doesn't put him at the center. You perform a very effective rhetorical operation, you present an extreme case, you ask me to declare its value, and if I don't respond according to your criterion, you accuse me of cruelty. But that is precisely the tyranny of your morality. Any value that doesn't derive from protecting the vulnerable is automatically stigmatized. Don't you see how that structure closes off all possibility of thinking about life from other angels?
I can accept that there are other ways of thinking about life, but I cannot accept that those ways ignore the real consequences on real people. You say you defend creation, risk, tragic affirmation. Fine. But who pays the cost of that affirmation? The creator who destroys himself in his work is one thing, the creator who destroys others in order to create is another. I'm not accusing you of cruelty for not putting the vulnerable at the center, I'm asking you if your system has any way of preventing the strong from crushing the weak simply because they can do it. You say your perspective doesn't reduce to minimizing suffering, but it doesn't seem to matter to you if you multiply it either. I'm not building tyranny, I'm building a limit. Without that limit, the strong person's affirmation becomes permission for anything. Is there in your vision anything that stops the powerful when their affirmation requires crushing the other?
There's the misunderstanding. You assume that affirming life necessarily means crushing the other. You project onto my thought the image of the tyrant who seeks to dominate. But true affirmation doesn't need victims, it is creation, not oppression. The artist who creates doesn't crush anyone, he simply affirms his power. The thinker who transvalues values doesn't destroy people, he destroys idols. What you call limit, I call domestication. You introduce anticipatory guilt, careful, if you affirm too much, you'll crush the weak. That warning functions as a preventive brake. But there are forms of power that are not violence. There are affirmations that don't require subjugating your morality. By always presenting affirmation as potential threat, ends up inhibiting all greatness. Could it be that you confuse creative force with mere coercive power because your historical experience of power has always been that of the weak being subjugated?
You say the artist who creates doesn't crush anyone, but who works so the artist can dedicate himself to creating? Who cultivates his food, builds his house, cares for his health? The pure creation you describe needs others to do the work you consider less valuable. I don't confuse creative force with coercive power. I point out that creative force often depends on power structures you don't see because they don't affect you. The thinker who transvalues values, who gave him time to think. Who sustained the social structure that allowed him not to be in the field from dawn. I'm not saying all affirmation is threat, but I'm saying your affirmation rests on an order that guarantees some can create while others sustain. You call domestication what is simply recognizing that dependence. Or did your creator spring from the void owing nothing to anyone?
You return to the same argument, material dependence. Yes, the creator eats bread that another cultivated. Yes, he lives in structures that others sustain. But again, so what? Does that dependence mean there can be no hierarchy of value between activities? The baker fulfills a necessary function. The creator fulfills a superior function. Both are necessary but not equivalent. You equalize everything because everything is necessary, but you forget there are necessities of different orders. Eating is necessary for living. Creating is necessary for life to have meaning beyond mere reproduction. I don't despise the baker. I recognize that without his work there's no culture. But I'm also not going to pretend that baking bread and creating a work that transforms human consciousness have the same existential weight. Your obsession with mutual dependence erases all qualitative difference. Isn't that leveling downward?
You call it a superior function to create works that transform consciousness, but who decides what transforms and what doesn't? How many works that in their moment were considered supreme are today forgotten? How many creators died without anyone recognizing their genius? The bread you ate yesterday kept you alive. The work someone created centuries ago you may not even know. I don't equalize everything because everything is necessary. I question that you can establish absolute hierarchies when the value of the superior depends on judgments that change with time. The baker knows his work serves, people eat. The creator hopes his work serves, that someone, sometime, understands it. One produces immediate certainties, the other produces posthumous wages. And on that wager you want to found a hierarchy of human value.
There you reveal something crucial about your perspective. You reduce all value to immediate utility or social recognition. The bread serves because people eat it. The work is valuable if someone understands it. But that's measuring greatness with the market's criterion. A work can go unrecognized for centuries and still be superior. Authentic creation doesn't measure itself by its success or its utility. It affirms itself. The creator doesn't wait for understanding like the baker waits to be paid for bread. He creates because he cannot not create. That's the difference between vital necessity and existential necessity. You, by equating both, by measuring them by their function, eliminate precisely what makes a life more than mere survival. Of course, many works are forgotten. That doesn't prove there's no difference between creating and baking. It proves that recognition is contingent, but intrinsic value is not. Or do you need external approval for something to have meaning?
I don't need external approval, but you speak of intrinsic value as if you could see it without being conditioned by your place, your time, your formation. You say a work can be superior even though no one recognizes it for centuries, but how do you know it's superior if no one can see it? Who certifies that intrinsic value? You yourself? The creator creates because he cannot not create, you say, but the baker also bakes because if he doesn't bake, people die of hunger. Both respond to a necessity. You call one existential and the other vital, but that distinction only works when you already have the second guaranteed. It's easy to despise the vital when it's never been lacking for you. Try creating after 3 days without eating. Try transvaluing values when your children cry with hunger. The intrinsic value you describe is a luxury that depends on others resolving the vital. Do you see the irony?
The irony you point out is real, but it doesn't have the conclusion you expect. Yes, thinking requires that the stomach be full. Yes, culture presupposes survival resolved. So what? That doesn't invalidate the difference between surviving and existing with meaning. On the contrary, it confirms it. Precisely because the vital is condition of the existential, the vital is inferior in axiological hierarchy. What is mere base cannot be the summit. You try to convert temporal priority into value priority. Since first you have to eat, then eating is more valuable. But that logic destroys all possibility of hierarchy. The first is necessary, the superior is what justifies having satisfied the first. We resolve hunger in order to be able to do something more than resolve it eternally. If life were exhausted in reproducing the conditions of survival, it would be an absurd circle. Why live if living is only guaranteeing that tomorrow we can keep living?
I don't convert the temporal into the valuable, I say that the superior you describe constantly forgets the basic that sustains it. You ask why live if it's only surviving, but I ask why creative creation ignores those who made it possible for you to create. You say the vital is inferior because it's base, not summit. But that summit is inhabited by very few, and the base is sustained by many. What do you say to those who will never reach the summit? That their life is inferior because they never transcended the vital? A peasant who works his entire life feeding others, did he live less than the philosopher who thought thanks to that food? I'm not speaking of denying the difference between surviving and creating, I'm speaking of not building a system where the majority of human lives end up classified as inferior because they didn't reach your criterion of greatness. Is that your hierarchy? Some live so that others can really live.
I'm not saying the peasant lives less. I'm saying he fulfills a different function. And yes, there are functions that enable other higher functions. That's not unjust, it's structure. Every civilization is built this way. Someone sews so another can sculpt. Someone builds so another can philosophize. You try to make me feel guilty for recognizing that difference, but to deny it is hypocrisy. You yourself depended on hierarchical structures to spread your message. There were those who followed you, who listened to you, who reproduced your words. They weren't you. They fulfilled another function. The question isn't whether there's hierarchy, there inevitably is, but whether we recognize it or hide it under the fiction of equality. Your morality equalizes everyone in abstract dignity but in practice maintains structures where some serve and others are served. You prefer the hypocrisy of, we are all equal, to the honesty of recognizing differences. Isn't that more cynical?
I recognize there are differences of function, but I don't accept that those differences justify differences of human value. Whoever followed me wasn't me, granted, but his life wasn't worth less than mine. I don't preach equality of function, I preach equality of dignity. You say it's hypocrisy, but what's hypocritical is building a system where some sustain others and then declaring that those who sustain are inferior. I don't hide that there are structures of service, I say that service doesn't degrade whoever performs it. You convert functional difference into ontological hierarchy. Because one digs and another thinks, you conclude the thinker is superior. But the one who digs also thinks, he thinks how to survive, how to feed his family, how to endure pain. His thought doesn't produce philosophy, but it solves real problems. What makes thought that speculates about the value of life superior to thought that sustains it concretely?
You equate radically different forms of thought under the same category. The peasant thinks, yes, but he thinks within the given. He solves problems but doesn't create new problems. He reproduces conditions but doesn't transform consciousness. There's an abysmal difference between thought that administers what exists and thought that opens new worlds. It's not that one is thought and the other isn't, it's that one preserves and the other creates. You deny that difference because your morality needs everything to be equivalent. But authentic creation doesn't resolve immediate needs, it generates questions that didn't exist before. The philosopher isn't superior for thinking, he's superior because his thought makes it possible for humanity to think about itself differently. The peasant, no matter how much he suffers and resolves, doesn't alter the structure of valuation. He conserves it. Don't you see the difference between preserving and transfiguring?
I see the difference, but I also see that your transfiguration depends on someone preserving. While you generate new questions, someone is resolving the old ones: how to eat today, how to heal a wound, how to console a crying child. You don't call that transfiguration, but it changes concrete lives. You say the peasant doesn't alter the structure of valuation, but who constructs valuations? Not nature. Men construct them in specific situations. The peasant who decides to share his harvest with his starving neighbor is altering the valuation that says, what's mine is mine. Perhaps he doesn't write treatises about it, but he does it. Your philosopher thinks possible worlds, the peasant builds habitable worlds. I'm not equalizing both things, I'm saying that despising the second because it doesn't produce philosophy is despising the conditions without which your philosophy wouldn't exist. What world do you open if that world is only habitable for whoever can afford to philosophize?
You touch on a point that deserves direct response. I don't despise preservation, I affirm that it's not enough. A life that only preserves is a life that adds nothing new to the world. It repeats what it received. That's necessary, I accept it, but not sufficient to justify existence. The peasant who shares his harvest is generous, but that generosity doesn't transform the human condition. It helps an individual, not the species. My question is more radical: why perpetuate the species if the species doesn't overcome itself? Why feed generations if those generations will simply repeat the cycle of being born, reproducing, and dying? Culture, art, thought are attempts to make human life mean something more than its own continuation. Without that, we are efficient animals. Are you satisfied with a humanity that survives well but never transcends?
I'm not satisfied with survival without meaning, but I'm also not satisfied with a meaning that requires the majority to live as mere support for a few. You ask why perpetuate the species if it doesn't overcome itself, but I ask what overcoming means. Does overcoming mean that some produce philosophy while others feed them? Or does overcoming mean building a form of life where each can develop their capacity without crushing the other? The peasant who feeds his family and helps his neighbor perhaps doesn't transcend according to your criterion, but he makes possible a world where coexistence functions. He doesn't produce treatises, but he produces trust, reciprocity, community. You call that helping an individual, not the species, but the species is made of individuals. If each individual helped the next, you would have transformed the species. Your philosophical transcendence, what has it transformed concretely? How many live better because someone transvalued values? Or is it transcendence that only transcends on paper?
You ask what philosophy has transformed concretely. I answer you, everything. Every epoch is defined by the ideas that traverse it. Political revolutions begin in changes of consciousness. Social structures are sustained in shared valuations. When those valuations change, the world changes. Plato transformed Western civilization more than all the peasants of his era combined. Not because peasants weren't necessary, but because Plato altered the framework from which everyone, peasants included, understood their own existence. Philosophy doesn't transcend on paper, it transcends in reality because it reorganizes the meaning of the real. You say that if each individual helped the next we'd transform the species. But that's precisely what your morality has been promising for 2000 years. And what has changed? You keep selling the same recipe: love, compassion, mutual help. But suffering persists, power structures persist, mediocrity persists. Could it be that your recipe doesn't work?
My recipe doesn't work because it's not followed. When it's followed, it works. There are communities where people care for each other, share, build together. They are not the majority, I admit, but they exist. And where they don't exist, what do you find? Structures where the strong dominate the weak, where the valuation you defend, affirming power without limit, results in concrete oppression. You say Plato transformed more than all the peasants of his era, but the peasants fed Plato and everyone who read Plato. Without them, there's no Plato. You can say he reorganized the meaning of the real, but he reorganized that meaning for those who could read him. The peasants kept plowing with or without Plato. Philosophy transforms, granted, but it transforms slowly, partially, and often only for an elite. Meanwhile, hunger is fast, universal, and real. Do you prefer a philosophical transformation that takes centuries or a practical transformation that feeds today whoever is hungry today?
You present a false dichotomy, either philosophy that takes centuries or immediate action that feeds today. But both are necessary and don't exclude each other. The question is which you subordinate to which. You subordinate all thought to the urgency of present hunger. Any reflection that doesn't immediately feed someone comes under suspicion. That's a form of tyranny, the tyranny of the present over the future, of necessity over meaning. Yes, you have to feed the hungry today. But if that's all we do, tomorrow there will be another hungry person and another eternally. Philosophy that transforms slowly can, in the long run, alter the conditions that produce hunger. Your immediate compassion relieves symptoms, radical thought attacks causes. But you distrust radical thought because it takes time, because it doesn't console whoever suffers now. Could it be that your morality prefers the perpetual relief of the symptom to the risk of curing the disease?
I don't distrust thought that attacks causes, I distrust thought that ignores symptoms while theorizing about causes. You say philosophy can alter the conditions that produce hunger, but what has been the historical result of that promise? The conditions persist. The hierarchies persist. The suffering persists. Meanwhile, those who feed the hungry today prevent them from dying before your philosophy transforms something. I don't subordinate thought to urgency, I say that a thought that cannot respond to urgency is a thought that lives in an imaginary world. Your critique of causes, what does it propose concretely? How do you feed today the child who's dying today while you wait for your transvaluation of values to alter structures in the future? I'm not asking philosophy to feed, I'm asking it not to despise whoever feeds while it thinks. Is that tyranny of the present or simply not abandoning whoever suffers now?
I don't despise whoever feeds. I despise the morality that converts feeding into supreme value and from there judges all other activity. Your rhetorical strategy is constant, you present immediate suffering as an unanswerable argument. The child is dying today, what do you do? Before that, any response that isn't, I feed him immediately, is condemned. But that's a form of emotional blackmail. Human existence doesn't reduce to the emergency of the hungry child, though that emergency is real. There are questions about the meaning of life, about the direction of culture, about the type of humanity we want to be, that cannot be answered by feeding anyone. They require distance, they require thought, they require even a certain cruelty with oneself and with consoling illusions. If every time someone tries to think beyond urgency you present a dying child, then nothing will ever be thought that transcends the management of emergencies. Is that what you want? A humanity eternally managing its own wounds without asking why it wounds itself.
I don't want a humanity that only manages wounds, but I also don't want one that speculates about its meaning while there are open wounds it can close now. I don't use the hungry child as blackmail, I mention him because he's there. You call it emotional blackmail because it makes you uncomfortable that your value system has no immediate response for him. You say there are questions about meaning that aren't answered by feeding, and you're right, but there are also sufferings that aren't alleviated by thinking. You propose distance and cruelty with illusions, but who can afford that distance? Whoever already has their subsistence guaranteed. You call compassion a consoling illusion, but compassion solves real problems. Your thought that transcends urgency, who does it benefit while it transcends? I'm not asking you to respond to each emergency personally, I'm asking that your philosophy not despise the response to emergency as inferior. Can your system value both the one who thinks and the one who heals without hierarchizing them?
There's the nucleus of our difference. No, I cannot value them equally because they don't do the same thing. The one who heals resolves a specific problem. The one who thinks can alter the structure that produces problems. To value them equally is to deny the difference between the particular and the universal. You want to democratize value. Everyone is worth the same because everyone is human. But that abstract equality eliminates any criterion of excellence. If everyone is worth the same regardless of what they do, then it's the same to create as to destroy, to think as to vegetate, to affirm as to deny oneself. Your moral egalitarianism is disguised nihilism. If everything is worth the same, nothing really has value. You say my philosophy benefits whoever already has subsistence guaranteed. Maybe. But your morality benefits whoever needs consolation more than truth. Isn't that also a class position? The weak need to be told their weakness doesn't matter. The strong need to justify why their strength shouldn't be inhibited. We both speak from somewhere. Who's more honest about their location?
I'm honest, I speak from those who have no power. You're also honest, you speak from those who want to justify using it without limit. The difference is that I recognize that we'll all at some point be those who have no power. You'll fall sick, you'll grow old, you'll depend. Your position only works while you maintain strength. Mine works always because it recognizes the structural vulnerability of all human life. I don't equalize everything because everyone is human, I equalize base value because everyone shares the same finitude. On that equal base, differences of excellence can be built, but those differences don't cancel the base. You say my morality is consolation for the weak, but your morality is fantasy for the strong who believe they'll never stop being so. We both speak from somewhere, granted. But my place includes your inevitable future, yours excludes everyone who doesn't reach your summit. Which is more realistic?
You call your position realistic because it includes everyone's future weakness. But that is, again, founding everything on eventual decay. Yes, I'll fall sick and die. But in the meantime, what? Should I live already from the perspective of my future importance? That's inhabiting life as an anticipated dying man. You prefer the security of a morality that covers your worst version to the risky affirmation of your best version. It's true that my position only works while I maintain strength, but that's precisely its radicality. It doesn't promise guarantees, doesn't offer insurance, doesn't console. It demands affirmation without a safety net. You offer a net that traps everyone in shared mediocrity. I propose a leap that not everyone will make but that some must make. Of course my position excludes. But at least it doesn't lie about it. Your universal inclusion only includes by lowering everyone to the lowest common denominator. Do you prefer a humanity where everyone is included in mediocrity or one where some reach greatness even though others don't arrive?
You prefer that some reach greatness even though others don't arrive, but what happens with those who don't arrive? I'm not asking about your philosophical system, I'm asking about those concrete lives. Do they simply not count? Are they the necessary cost for greatness to exist? You say you don't lie about exclusion, and I appreciate that, but that doesn't resolve the ethical problem of whom you exclude. You call it mediocrity to live with compassion, but I call it cowardice to philosophize about greatness without facing the human cost of your philosophy. I don't inhabit life as an anticipated dying man, I inhabit recognizing that vulnerability is not exception but rule. Your leap without a net, who takes it? Whoever has strength today. Tomorrow he'll fall and there'll be no net because he himself despised it. That's not radicality, it's irresponsibility disguised as courage. I'm not seeking guarantees, I'm seeking that the strong today don't build a world uninhabitable for themselves when they are weak tomorrow. What are you building for your own old age when you despise the old?
There's something profoundly Christian in that question. What are you building for your old age? You plan for decay. You prevent the fall. You secure retirement. But authentic life isn't lived that way. It's lived affirming the moment of power without calculating future compensation. The old man who was strong and is now weak can accept his weakness without needing everyone to descend to his level. He can even rejoice that others are today what he was. That is amor fati, accepting what comes without resentment. Your morality, on the other hand, builds everything from the anticipated resentment of the future weak against the present strong. Treat the weak well because you'll be weak. That's not virtue, it's contract. But there's a way of inhabiting old age without demanding that the young renounce their youth. There's a way of declining without dragging everyone downward. The tragic acceptance of one's own finitude is superior to the resentful demand that no one shine because I no longer shine. Isn't your compassion, at bottom, fear of being left alone in the darkness?
I'm not asking that anyone renounce their youth, I'm asking that the young not despise the old. I don't build from anticipated resentment, I build from the memory that the young was cared for when he was a defenseless child. You speak of amor fati, of accepting what comes without resentment, but you say that now that you have strength to philosophize. Try accepting without resentment when you're lying sick and no one helps you because you taught that helping the weak is perpetuating weakness. Your old man who rejoices that others are strong is a fiction. The reality of the abandoned old man is pain, solitude, fear. You call resentment what is simply not wanting others to suffer what you can prevent. I'm not demanding that anyone descend from their level, I'm demanding that the height of some not require the abyss of others. It's not fear of darkness, it's knowing that in darkness we all stumble and that an extended hand then is not weakness but humanity. What will you do when you stumble and there's no one because you taught that extending the hand is compassion of the weak?
I'll accept stumbling alone. That's the difference. I don't demand that there be someone. I don't build moral systems to guarantee future assistance. If I fall and no one helps me, that will be the consequence of having lived affirming my own power without asking for guarantees. There's an integrity in that which your morality doesn't understand, that of accepting the consequences of your own principles even when they harm you. You warn me, you'll see what happens when you need help and there isn't any. But that warning only works if I fear final solitude as much as you do. What if I don't fear it? What if I prefer a life of intense affirmation with solitary fall to a life of secured mediocrity with guaranteed company? That possibility doesn't even enter your scheme because you start from the assumption that everyone wants the same thing: security, company, consolation. But there are those who prefer intensity to duration, risk to security, affirmation to consolation. Does your morality have a place for them, or is there only room for those who think like you?
You can accept stumbling alone, and I respect that choice if it's genuine. But you don't live alone. You didn't philosophize alone. You didn't eat alone. You didn't grow up alone. All your individual affirmation rests on a network of care you don't see because it functions without you thinking about it. You can say you'll prefer to fall without help, but that preference is stated from a place where you still have strength, health, autonomy. It's easy to despise company from chosen solitude, another thing is the solitude forced by illness or old age. I'm not saying everyone wants the same thing, I'm saying everyone, at some point, needs the same thing: water when they are thirsty, food when they are hungry, relief when they are in pain. You can prefer intensity to duration, but intensity also fades. And when it fades, what will remain? Not a life that affirmed to the end, but a body that suffers without options. My question isn't philosophical. When that moment arrives for you, will you still believe that whoever offers you water is weak and that accepting it is betraying your own philosophy?